Thank you, dear.
Yeah, sorry, I was in the misogyny class.
Yes, I can.
I'm assuming Robert got back to you. He was, so.
Okay, folks, thank you very much for joining us here today. Our guest speaker for today is Kim Bennett, who is a speech-language pathologist with Wellington Kids. Just very quickly, I know that some of you may have seen from the post before. I am beyond excited to hear what Kim is sharing with you. And the reason, just for two reasons, I guess. One is, from her own personal standpoint, it was a speech-language pathologist who first brought to our attention that there may be something up with Jacob. They were in our particular case, our first responder. And the reason for it was because they're the individuals who deal with articulation challenges. They're also the ones who look at the early language development. And it was by the age of 3 that a speech-language pathologist brought it to our attention that there was something really going on with Jacob here. And that was long before we ever had a diagnosis or even had an understanding of what we might be dealing with. So from that standpoint, we totally appreciate the work that you guys do. And then the other one, just to share with you, is, again, there was a recent study that came out done in the Netherlands last year, and they looked at the population of children who require speech-language support. From a general population standpoint, they put it at about 10 to 15%. They then looked at the population for children with FASD. They discovered 90% require speech-language pathology support. So we know that when we look at the multidisciplinary diagnostic aspect, speech-language is key. So, Kim Bennett.
Thanks, Rob. So, yeah, I practice out of my own private practice in Kemptville called Wellington Kids. We work mostly with toddlers with speech and language delays and some school-age kids. Typically developing kids with special needs. I don't know that we have any kids with FASD on our caseload at the moment, at least not diagnosed. Just to note, like, we, at the time that I went to school, we didn't really have any training in FASD, like it was very minimal. I've had to do some extra research for this presentation. I do have a family member who was diagnosed with FASD a couple of years ago, so I've done a lot of personal learning in this area since that time. But a lot of it is not something that I have a whole ton of training in. And I'm also on mat leave, so I'm feeling a little bit out of touch with just general speech and language stuff right now. So if there's any questions that you have that I can't answer for you today, I'll give you my contact information and I can look into things for you. So I'm planning on just talking about some general background on communication disorders, defining speech and language, looking at typical and atypical speech and language development, and then going into communication disorders in FASD and considerations for SLP assessment and therapy for kids with FASD, and just briefly how to access SLP services. I found this great little infographic on someone's Instagram account, which is linked at the bottom there. So just differentiating between speech and language. So speech, what we typically think of speech-language pathologists working on is the articulation, and that's what I'll talk most about today. I'm not really going to go into voice or fluency. So articulation being those speech sounds, so the ability to produce specific sounds, such as saying wabbit instead of rabbit, which is what we kind of generally think of speech-language pathologists working on. And then, so language consisting of more of that broad, the system of how we're communicating our thoughts. So that's broken down into receptive language, expressive language, and pragmatics. Receptive being what we understand. So things like following directions, pointing to pictures. If I have 4 pictures and say, point to the horse, is the child able to do that? Following directions, if I say, first find your coat and then put your shoes on, are they able to do that in order? Expressive language, so how we express ourselves, how we use and combine words to share thoughts, ideas, communicate wants and needs. So that's looking at things like vocabulary. If I show a picture of a horse, is the child able to label that appropriately? And then what is their grammar looking like? Are they able to form their ideas into sentences that make sense? Or are they leaving out words that convey important information? And pragmatics, so is that social use of language, how we communicate with other people. So not only understanding and using language, but then how we're actually applying that in social situations with other people. So articulation, we know it's a really complex skill. Refined, quick movements in our mouth. We don't think about it when we talk, but there's a lot going on really fast, and I'll show you a slide, a couple slides from now that shows where all those sounds are made in our mouth. Children must learn how to not only produce each of those sounds, but also how to combine them together. So if they can say that sound on its own, the S sound, can they also then say C and ice, and then use those in a full sentence? We know that there's a typical developmental sequence of when sounds are learned, and that there's typical and atypical errors, which I'll go into a little bit. But at 2 years of age, typically only about 50% of speech is understood by an unfamiliar listener. And that's just as they're learning language. It's like kids have to learn to crawl before they learn to walk. They have to learn to practice all of those different sounds. By 4 years of age, I'm expecting to understand about 100% of a child's speech. So they may still have a number of speech sound errors, especially some of those later developing sounds like R and TH are more difficult sounds to learn. But if a child is saying like wed instead of red by 4, I can usually pick out what they're trying to say. It might just be like a pet's name or a family member's name. If it's a more difficult name to say, I might not understand that fully. So this shows where in the mouth all of those sounds are made. I liked this depiction of it because it's not something that we think about at all, but it is really complex. We're moving our tongue, our lips, our jaw so quickly. These are the consonant sounds, and there's also the vowels, but produced all through the mouth. So quite complex skill in terms of both motor, but also sensory. So as we're speaking, we're getting information sent back to the brain about where all of those articulators are meeting together. And this is typical milestones in terms of when speech sounds are learned by each age. So even for a typically developing child, it takes 6 years of practice from birth to being able to master all of those sounds. So you can really imagine our kids with special needs, how much more difficult of a skill that can be. I'm not going to go into these in a whole lot of detail. If you have questions, you can let me know, but there's typical speech sound errors that if you're talking to a 2 or 3 year old, you're probably hearing a lot of these kinds of errors still at that point. But again, they're not typically impacting a whole lot on our ability to understand them. So if they're saying nana instead of banana, we can usually pick out what that means, or wed instead of red. So as adults, if you have experience with working with young, typically developing kids, your ears are kind of just trained to figure out these sound errors. Whereas these are not considered typical errors at any age, and they impact on that intelligibility, our ability to understand them a bit more. So those bottom 3 too, so nasalization is that voice having nasal quality to it. Dentalization is that frontalist that we think of when like a child says soup instead of soup. And lateralization means the sound comes out the side like soup or soup. So those can be more indicative of some kind of structural issue, which we can see more frequently in FASD. So people are always curious what causes speech sound disorders. And I found this great little graphic on ASHA, which is the American Speech Language Hearing Association website. So most of the time they're that functional, so we don't know what causes them. There can be motor and linguistic aspects in terms of not being able to actually produce the sounds, or kind of not understanding the difference between sounds. Like if you think of the words big versus pig, the b versus p, there's such a fine distinction, but that changes the meaning. And some kids have a hard time like hearing the difference between those, so then to be able to say the difference is difficult as well. There can be organic causes of speech sound disorders, so motor, structural, and sensory. And if you just look at these, you can see where those fall into FASD as well. So, so like motor planning can be an area of difficulty. We know that there's commonly cleft palate or oral facial anomalies, structural deficits, and hearing impairment are all common things in FASD. So that was a bit about the speech side, and then we'll talk a little bit to language disorders. So there's general milestones for all of those areas that we talked about: expression, comprehension, social language. So just a couple of examples up here, but like, so by 1 year of age, we're expecting kids to use at least 3 words. So that's an expressive milestone. To follow simple one-step instructions: go find your boots. And follow a point would be the social language, so we know that this carries meaning. And then, I mean, there's so much learning that happens so quickly in those early years. So by 5 years, they're going from using 3 words to describing past, present, and future events in detail, following group directions. So in a classroom, if this, then that, like lots of really complex language, and like using language to discuss emotions. So when I'm doing an assessment of a child for a possible language disorder, I'm basically using some kind of standardized assessment to look at some of those areas, breaking them down even further into expressive, comprehension, and social language, and just kind of looking at where they're falling compared to other peers their age. So language delays and disorders may include difficulties with any or all of these in combination. So some kids might be presenting average with their development in expressive and receptive language, but have more difficulty with like initiating or maintaining conversation, reading nonverbal cues, some of those other social language areas, or they might be globally delayed across these areas. Or, yeah, so any combination of those. And so speech and language pathology can work on all of those different areas. We know that the impact of untreated speech and language disorders on quality of life ranges from things like mental health issues, anxiety, depression, self-esteem, frustration, even for those young kids who aren't able to express themselves through language. A lot of those are going to turn into like behaviors for communication, impacts on relationships, academic achievement, obviously if they're not understanding things that are going on in the classroom, understanding the instruction, or able to express themselves. Reading and writing are also part of language development. Impact on career opportunities down the road, and trouble with the law. I don't have the exact statistic, but I know that there's a percentage of like young offenders who have language disorders as well. So we know those are all impacted. Any questions so far? Okay.
Are we going to have a copy of the slide?
I can send, I sent it to Rob, so if you can send it,
Yeah, it'll be posted up in the Facebook page afterwards.
Awesome.
This is amazing information. When Rob and I had adopted Jacob, or the girls for that matter, like some of this stuff, right? Like what we know now is so much more than when we adopted. Like we had no clue. Yeah, I didn't know why my GP kept asking me how many words can he speak. I don't know. Am I supposed to count? Like I don't know. Right? But I get it now, right? And I got it once a speech language pathologist explained it to me. But this is the kind of information that new parents should know, right? Because that's part of the early identifier is, and how many of us knew that going into being a parent, right?
Yeah.
So it's amazing.
I have a 2 year, my son is making 2 years in January, but I'm just relating to everything you shared, and it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I think, especially also for some of the older kids that I work with or I parent, there's a real distinction between their expressive language, they're quite profound in being able to express themselves, and hide their receptive language difficulties, right? And so people misunderstand or misinterpret just how much they are understanding, and then thinking that they're just being, a behavior issue, or they're just choosing not to listen, they know what they should be doing, those sorts of things. And I'm wondering if a speech language assessment is sometimes a useful strategy for kids who have that kind of, especially like 12, 13, 14-year-olds who are getting misinterpreted sometimes.
I would say, yeah, it would be helpful to kind of piece out where the gaps are too.
It's not a standard practice to have speech language. Like you have to ask for it, right? Like it's not.
Yeah.
Like you know how now
If
hearing.
you really ask.
Yeah.
Like now hearing is typically assessed, right? Very young at age. I know we had a foster child that I had to take several times in her, like I had her for 10 months and I had to take her several times and stuff. So I know they do that kind of assessment now, which they never used to, but they don't do speech language automatically, do they?
No, I mean so with this one, like the doctor's appointments early on, like they're checking those very general milestones, but no, there's not like a full assessment.
Well, and to take it one step further, we're currently in a real big catch-22 situation with this right now, because particularly if you're in the Ottawa area, the publicly funded organization is the Champlain Lynn for speech language pathology. Well, their policy now is you have to come in with a diagnosis and a recommendation from a medical practitioner in order to access speech language pathology. Well, we know you can't get the diagnosis, so now you've got a catch-22 where the other one is saying the other one has to do it first.
Yeah, they need I think at the time I was working at CCDC, it's still in now, but you needed a speech and language assessment in order to access speech and language services. They do the assessment again anyway, so I'm not sure, but
So
there's a whole other thing.
does that mean you need to almost go out and you have to hire a speech language pathologist yourself to do the assessment
Or
to get
through
the services?
school, so that it's still a bit of a complicated system through the schools to access services. The school boards do have speech language pathologists on staff, but they don't work on more severe articulation, so the speech sound disorders. They address language delays disorders at school, but they would do the assessment at school and can refer to.
The challenge with the school though is the school boards in our area, it is different in the urban centers, but in our areas, it actually goes back to the Champlain Lynn.
Well, no, we had in grade 2, we had the speech language pathologist of the board do that. I can't remember what the assessment was, but remember, I remember the colors, yellow and blue. I have to pull the report out that explained kind of what was going on with Jacob at that time. Do you remember that report? And that was the board. That was the board, but that was because of Mrs. Russo pushing for it. you remember that?
I think the reality is that there's not enough service around speech language.
Yeah.
And I think that oftentimes, at least in my experience, speech language isn't even mentioned as something that should be explored unless there's an articulation problem.
Yeah.
That seems to be the limit of what people see the area of expertise for speech language.
There's
And
so
I,
much more.
and I think especially for our kids, that often it is that difference between their expressive and their receptive language, and I think that's often how they're getting misinterpreted. I think they are misinterpreted by others, and I think that's a key piece that speech language can do for our kids, but accessing those services are often paid services. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
FASD though is often used as an excuse, oh, your child's having a problem because they have FASD, so we can ignore it. Now, in our case, our boy's a bit different. He came to us at age 4 in diapers with 20 words. Just really bad abuse beforehand, completely ignored. So none of that development was there. If he wanted something, he would grunt. Now, we, within about 8 months, had him using full sentences just by insisting on it, but he had a mental breakdown in school, which entailed he was gone for a year and a half on medical leave. But 4 years later, his speech has not come back, nor has his fine motor skills. And we're being told this is coming from the core. Now that's Janet Carioni. But how I help him, because if I go to my medical doctor, well, you need a report, you need something so I can refer you somewhere. But, and I go to the services, and the services will say, well, there are no services. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, because it's not just FASD, right? The early detection of a speech language, just, challenges
yeah.
could potentially put any child on a path for success if it was identified early enough, right?
Yeah, getting some of those reports.
Most services stop at about age 5 though too. Because Wayne had speech therapy till age 5 or 6, and then he's aged out now.
Yeah, that would be the preschool speech and language.
Yeah,
So like
the
language
language
express
express,
in
yeah.
this area.
Yeah, that's the one,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Glad you guys remember.
Yeah, when Cassie came to us, we could understand maybe 5 words. Skylar and her had their own language. It was, like, Skylar interpreted everything Cassie said. And she was almost 5 when she came to us. She was 4 and a half when she came to us, so. And nothing had been done at that point.
That's horrible.
My kids were diagnosed with their language problems when they were tested for ADHD, and they went through that SHNOG test. It's like, yeah, that was the only way, and nothing had come up until then, like it was ignored. I didn't think the problems they had were, until even reading it here, you realize, oh, that problem is from a speech side, it's not from something else.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to us, I can't remember what age it said, but, like our kids, you can't give 3, 4, 5, 6 directions,
Yeah.
right, at a time. It's like, step by step, please,
Yeah.
or else you lose it. And they've always been like that. And, it wasn't, I can't even remember how old they were until we were able to get to school to buy into that concept, but giving them so many directions, they can't follow it, right? Or if you're gonna give directions, make sure it's written down, pictographed, whatever, right? So that they can follow
Yeah.
that way.
Get more visual.
Yeah.
So I'll talk more about
Cool.
specifically for FASD. Those Canadian guidelines for diagnosis require impairment in 3 of 9 domains that are listed here. As far as I could find, if there's new or different information, okay. So communication specifically being one of those. So we can do those standardized assessments and look at where the kids are falling if there's suspected FASD. And like we're saying here, speech and language delays may also be an early sign of FASD. So yeah, often parents are noticing earlier on that there's some of those missed language milestones. So I have often like 18-month-olds or 2-year-olds who are coming in for assessments because the parents are concerned that they aren't talking yet. So when I'm doing those assessments of young kids, I'm looking at more global development as well. So not just how many words they're using, but what are their play skills like? What are their social skills like? Are they using gestures? Things like that. Looking for some of those more global concerns. So unfortunately, like a lot of areas in FASD, there's limited research, and the results are still a bit inconsistent, but we know that the majority of children with FASD present with speech and language disorders requiring therapy. There is a lack of uniform profile, so not every child with FASD presents with the same speech and language disorders. We know it's a spectrum disorder, so there's a variety of different impairments based on things like the amount of exposure, the brain areas affected, what their early experiences were like, and lots of different potential difficulty areas. So we know in FASD there's structural malformations and functional impairments in the brain itself, in the hearing mechanism, and in the oral cavity. So obviously all of those are tying in together to impact on speech and language development. I'm not going to go into any of the brain anatomy, but speech and language isn't just isolated in one area of the brain. It's there's different areas of the brain that are playing a role in all different aspects of speech and language. So even just that frontal lobe being responsible for executive functioning, like attention and organization. So the hearing mechanism, there's some percentage of children with FASD with hearing loss. That can be structural, so in the middle or inner ear issues, ear infections causing fluid buildup, but also auditory processing. So when the ear is getting information to the brain, but the brain has difficulty processing those sounds and information. And then also the oral cavity can be affected in FASD, so micrognathia, so small jaw. Velopharyngeal insufficiency is there's those muscles at the back of the throat that seal off for us to make oral versus nasal sounds, so like ma versus ba. If there's insufficiency in those muscles, that's going to affect some of that like nasality of speech. Cleft lip and palate are more common in FASD. Heightened palate and malocclusion of teeth, so how the teeth are meeting together if there's a space or if they're off to the side. So some of those structural issues with speech development. In infants and toddlers with FASD, so things like feeding and swallowing difficulties, motor and sensory issues. So I talked about those, the sensory information and the motor planning that's involved in all of those speech sounds happening so quickly as we speak. So things like poor muscle tone and coordination, increased food sensitivity, so if they're not experiencing as many textures, not kind of developing those tongue muscles in the same way. And so we see delayed speech and language milestones, so delays in babbling, first words, combinations of words. And then by school age, we can see a whole different range of related speech and language disorders listed here. We know as well there's additional challenges that are going to impact on speech and language, so things like emotional regulation, attention, if they're having trouble remaining regulated and paying attention in the classroom, they're not picking up those new vocabulary words, things like that, impacting on learning, memory, motor and sensory, and those early experiences can also all play in. So I looked at a study in 2014, which was from Manitoba FASD clinic. This was interesting because it did note that we often find like higher receptive language than expressive. This showed globally poor performance across domains. So it did not show that there were higher expressive language skills. 70% of the participants received a language rating of severe, and 85% of them overall received mild to severe language delay scores. There were only 15% that were in the average category. And it was also interesting that they noted a changing profile by age group. So the higher age group was having more difficulty with language. And so it's showing that we need to retest language over time. We can't have one speech and language assessment at like 6 or 7 and assume that's going to still apply at 11 or 12.
So was the needs increasing because they weren't getting intervention? Was it an intervention group or a non-intervention group? Do we know?
That was at the time of diagnosis, I think. So they didn't look at the children. They were looking at like a group of children who were in the diagnostic clinic.
Okay.
So they weren't looking at like a specific child's scores at this age and this age. They just looked at a group of 7-year-olds or whatever age, and then a group of older kids. And there was a difference.
Right.
So
So
I
it would have
don't
been
think-
without intervention.
Yeah. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And this was the study that Rob was talking about. So 90% of children with FASD display speech impairment. This study found that children with FASD were less intelligible, so we were understanding less of their language, displayed more consonant errors, and lower scores on auditory discrimination, so differentiating between like big and pig, and oral motor tasks. There were higher rates of errors, but again, no core of specific speech sound errors. But they did note that structural defects may be related to specific errors. So for example, the boys who had a heightened palate all showed denasalized speech. So just a couple quick last slides on speech and language assessment considerations. So these are things that we look at across assessments, but for kids with FASD, we'd want to pay some particular attention to some of these areas. So things like looking at those risk factors in the background information, looking at some of those early milestones and how they were meeting those, looking in more great detail at the oral structures and function. Articulation, expressive and receptive language are things that we're regularly assessing for, but looking more into those hidden deficit areas. So things like problem solving, behavior play, social skills, narrative, executive functioning, higher level language too. So that's those more abstract skills which are more difficult for kids with FASD. And again, that note to be reassessing over time and referring to assessments by other professionals if needed. So if there was concerns about auditory processing or hearing disorders, looking to refer to an audiologist, an OT for supporting sensory and motor concerns, and whatever other professionals, if they haven't been seen by a psychologist yet or a geneticist, etc. And some considerations for therapy. So again, speech and language pathologists are trained to highly individualize therapy based on the child's profile. With FASD, we'd want to pay attention especially to focusing on functionality, so building up their language for functional daily use and building on their strengths. Things like reducing visual and noise distractions in therapy, making expectations really clear as well, so some of those like visuals, using schedules and timers so they know what's to be expected, giving them like things like sensory toys and breaks. We know as well that generalization can be more challenging for kids with FASD, so they learn it in session, but they can't necessarily apply it out of session, so we're really needing to focus on teaching to that. Offering choice of activities, giving them some control over that, and switching it up so it's not frustrating for them if it's too challenging. And incorporating known information, so things that are more easy or interesting to them, using those to work on more difficult things, and having a plan if behavior escalates, so trying to move to an easier or more preferred task rather than having to end the session early. So this is a little bit about how to access speech and language services. So in this area, this preschool speech and language is Language Express, and those services cover till the end of junior kindergarten. CHIO Kids Inclusive have speech and language. I don't know that much about how to access those services, to be honest. The school board, again, has speech and language, but it's typically more on a consultative basis, so they consult to the teacher, give some ideas and strategies, but not necessarily working directly with the child. Again, the LIN is seeing kids with moderate to severe articulation, or voice or fluency issues. And then private services can be accessed typically if people have extended health benefits. There's a very minor amount of coverage for speech language services privately. And then I just made a note that typically, at least most of the SLPs that I've worked with have limited knowledge of and experience with FASD. Like I said, and at the time that I went to school, I graduated 7 years ago, and we didn't have really any training on FASD. So there's going to be probably a need to advocate for some of those FASD needs.
We
So I
never
have,
hear that in any other profession. You're the only profession. I'm kidding, we hear that all the time.
so I've got my contact information up here if you want to get in touch and have any other questions, or we can try to answer anything. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have one question regarding, and you made reference to the audiologists and the importance of how hearing pertains to this. And I do know that the study that I think a lot of us are familiar with, where they discovered there's 428 comorbid medical conditions that go with this. The third highest one is the Otitis Media, which affects like 60% of people with FASD. Now I know Otitis Media has something to do with hearing, I think, but do you happen to know what the Otitis Media is?
Otitis Media. Related to ear infections.
Okay.
So when there's that fluid built up.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one that I wondered about with it is, when I was reading through it, it struck me that I don't think that's one that our medical practitioners necessarily think about. It's not one we don't normally think about, having that referral to the audiologist to see if that's there. And it really struck me that the study found it's almost 60% of kids are going to have a challenge with that.
Yeah, and that can be structural as well. So
Yeah.
depending on the shape of the face and the structures, it's how those inner ear tubes are draining out. So if they're not, so we see ear infections a lot more often with kids than with adults, because the face shape changes over time, so it's not as flat. It's not my area of expertise, but
yeah, no, I fully understand that. I guess the other part that I really don't have an understanding right now is that, they always say that you should always get that hearing test done when the kids are young.
Yeah.
With the hearing test that they do, would it pick up on whether there is those challenges there at that point or not?
Not necessarily. So
Okay.
that, I always say to parents that that's a screening, and if there are later speech and language issues, then a hearing assessment should be redone.
Okay, well, thank you.
Okay.
That's definitely what I thought, and I know it's one that I think a lot of us don't necessarily think about.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's a common referral that I'll suggest regardless, if there's speech and language concerns.
okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
just to
Is
rule out.
there some kind of, I don't know, one